In this presentation, we'll talk about the shape of knowledge. That is, how knowledge becomes an image, a form of design, how writing and then later computing is turning into a visual communication, where the shape of the letters, of the numbers, of the types has an impact on the way we transmit knowledge. So in this presentation, we'll talk about the process of automation, of printing, of typography, kind of writing the typos, the model, the imprint. We'll talk about the automation of writing, so typewriting, the process of how writing moves from the individual sign of calligraphy to a standardized sign, so the type again. And we'll observe in the story of the Italian company Olivetti how from typewriting there is the seed of the development of a new model of transmission of knowledge and calculation and computing of information. Now, the typographic revolution, so the radical change in the form of transmission of knowledge, happens in 1455. Starts with Gutenberg's invention of the printing press. This technique will have a profound impact on Europe. You all know that the first book that was published and printed with this new technique was actually the Bible, and this will have an impact in the Germanic areas on Martin Luther and his propagation of the Bible, of reading the Bible, of a personal reading of the Bible that launched the project of his Reformation. Now, first impact of the typographical revolution is really a new circulation, a new availability of knowledge. So the multiplication of books makes it possible to have personal copies of the Bible, and this is also what makes it possible to conduct like a silent reading of it, which is what Luther is really advocating for. Before then, the Bible was read as a collective experience, so was proclaimed and read out loud for a community of people, not necessarily read in silence. Now, the process of the printing press is something that also makes it possible, and this is the second consequence of Gutenberg's invention, to really design knowledge. You know that like the page for the machinery of Gutenberg must be arranged with a number of typos, types. The word typos in Greek means mark, impression, outline, figure, or image. But the typos is actually an object. So what we see in the page is the imprinting of that object, of that mold on the page, leaving an outline, a figure on that page. So in this sense, the process implies the gathering, the design of the types, but also their pagination, their editing, the lining up of these letters that form pages that can be replicated a number of times in a number of copies. So the third consequence of the typographic revolution of the printing press by Gutenberg is the fact that knowledge becomes replicable or serialized. So instead of like books that were copied by the singular individual handwriting of the copiers, now the book becomes really an industrial product. So the machine produces a prototype that is replicated in a number of equal copies. Now, the human gesture of writing is not removed from Gutenberg's method. it actually changes. So from the handwritten texts, so for example, here we have like an example of the Carolina minuscula, so the form of handwriting that was kind of providing a stereotypical way of designing letters on the page. So from that handwritten text process, we move to the printing press, which still contains a human gesture of writing. It's not pure machinery. So the human gesture is the gesture of impressing molds on paper, which implies the artisanal work of designing like a page, designing the molds, but also realizing a prototype, so ordering them up in the page. Now, the great designer of books was actually an Italian publisher. His name was Aldo Manutius, who worked in Venice and who had like the largest publishing house in Europe in the 16th century. Under Manutius, there is a new development of the type, which is brought forth by one of his designers, Francesco Griffo. And this development is an attempt to replicate the handwritten writing into a printed form. And this is what we know as the italics. Now, this is important because the human gesture is related to the letter and to the page that compose a prototype. So the letter, when we say letter, we have to talk about the font, or rather the typos, the type. The letter really becomes the first object of design. So these molds are actual bronze objects, and what we see as the letters on page are their impression on another surface. Now, the designing of letters becomes really an important element in the transmission, the visual transmission of knowledge, and all the fonts that we know and that we have in our Microsoft Word processor softwares programs are actually the names of designers who worked on producing molds with ever new, ever different forms. The most important ones that I want to mention here are Claude Garamond. He's a French designer, and he's the first one who designed a font which was not meant to replicate or imitate manual writing. The most important British designer of fonts is John Baskerville, and Baskerville is one of the fonts we commonly use also with Garamond. And the most important Italian designer is Bodoni, and Bodoni is this font. Now, together with the design of letters, the human input in the design of knowledge, of the new knowledge of books as industrial standardized products, is related to the pagination, to the design of how a sheet looks like. And so the page becomes really a drawing sheet of letters and images. So letters are placed as a way in the page, as a way to shape an image of a text of writing. Now, this will give rise to the elaboration of pages, including images and words, like the frontispiece of frontespizio, the opening page of several books, which contain an elaborate design, not just of the letters composing the title, but also of their actual images, corresponding images. And this process will be related to the development of journalism, so the development of like graphic characters, the letter as a graphic characters with a particular impact on us. Think of like how when we use bold or when we underline a word. So how words become something else than just an accumulation of letters. And also this process will be in the 19th century related to the development of advertising, as that process combining together images and words. Now, we talked about the development of typography, so the writing of that typos, but in this second part, we'll talk about the process of automation of writing itself, of the gesture of writing. So type writing, the writing of a typos. Now, the birth date of the typewriter, what we know as the typewriter, is 1714, when Henry Mill patents an artificial machine or method for the impressing or transcribing of letters singly or progressively one after another. So the process to automate the gesture of writing, to kind of separate it, transcend it from the individual gesture and relating it to a mechanical gesture. After Mill, in the development of this technology, we have to mention an Italian scientist, engineer, Pellegrino Turri, who designed the carbon paper. So as a way to replicate or produce copies of the gesture of serialized writing or type writing. The real first typewriter, as we know it, appears much later in 1873. It's produced by Latham Sholes in Milwaukee, and it's the Sholes and Glidden typewriter, the first typewriter that includes a QWERTY keyboard. So a keyboard that lines up on the left kind of top line, the letters QWERTY, which is actually the keyboard we use on all our computers. The real success of typewriting, however, comes with the release of the Remington one. Remington was a company that was producing rifles, and it developed also the production of typewriters, and it became really the best and most widely known typewriter on the market. The most important model was the Calligraphy from Remington, where the name calligraphy really indicates beautiful writing. So the idea of standardized writing as something that could express a beautiful form of the letter. The other company that was really successful on the market of typewriters, especially the US market, was the Underwood of 1895, which kind of ratified also the success of the QWERTY model of keyboard. Now, typewriting really coincides with a market that opens up, especially in the US and then in Europe, but also with a revolution in society. So, for example, typewriting engenders a new role for women, the so-called typewriting girls. So with this new process of automated writing and serialized writing, office work gives a much larger access to women in the workforce, and by consequence in education. So typewriting is an object or a technology that enters on the market that stirs a social change. At the same time, typewriting is related to the development of advertising and to the development of a masculine space. So we talked about Remington as a company producing typewriters and rifles, and we see the idea of typewriting as appealing to a masculine audience in the late 19th century in the form of the comparison between the writing of letters and the shooting of letters. So the impressing of a letter with its ink on the paper as a shooting, really. Now, typewriting becomes really important also for the avant-garde, especially futurism, as an expression of the fascination for automatism, for a man that becomes like a machine, even in writing, that separates himself from his personal, individual, and irrepeatable gesture of handwriting. Now, this is a photodynamism by Bragaglia that really chooses as a theme the typewriter and the gesture of writing, of serialized writing, and the gesture of the transformation of the self into a machine. And the futurist composer, musician Russolo will also dedicate a musical piece to the typewriter itself. And I just want to play a little piece of it.
Macchina tipografica.
So the piano replicating the typing in the context of the engine civilization, the motor on the background. And the voice freeing itself, the thought that is transcribed on paper. So a thought that becomes a machine. Now, this is something that we'll see also in the idea of computing as the transmission of our thought into the act of writing, in the process of typing our thought into mechanical and replicable types. Now, in the avant-garde, especially in futurism, despite this emphasis on the mechanical element of writing, there is also a reaction against the form of typewriting that we described, which is related to a form of typographic experimentalism, which really pursues unrepeatable writing. So, for example, in the development of the words in freedom technique that puts together words and images in a particularly unrepeatable way, so they're not replicable or standardized. And this is even more true in Marinetti's report of kind of the Second Balkan War in Adrianople, described in the book. It's kind of his masterpiece, Zang Tum Tum, where you see that the act of the design of letters coincides with an action and coincides with an unreplicable, in a way, form of typewriting, less linear, less bound to the linear structure of the page, and really turning pages into sheets or canvases. So the word becomes a graphic sign, and the pages of the book become sheets and canvases. Now, the effort to transform or convert typewriting into personal writing, into calligraphy, into individual writing, and not just machinery or something that is soulless, continues during World War I, when there is an ample market of for pens, and pens are turned into rifles, for example, in this ad for Parker pen. So the act of writing is really an individual gestures, like handing a rifle. Now, in the last part of our presentation, I want to bring you to Ivrea, which is the site where the Olivetti company was born in 1908, as a way to connect this typewriting process to the development of computing, our modern computing. We talked about the founder of Olivetti, Camillo, in episode 11 of the podcast, and wanted to bring you to the first, to show you the first typewriter produced by Olivetti in 1911 as an import of American technology into Italy. So this is the M1 released in 1911 at the International Exposition of Turin, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Italy's unification. As you can see, the typewriter is designed for many purposes. The first one being the destination of typewriting to women. So women participate in the workforce, they are working in offices, and they are the first users of typewriters for bureaucracy or for secretarial work. At the same time, Olivetti conceives of the typewriter as an instrument for men, and not relating them anymore to the gesture of shooting, but mostly relating them to the creative gesture. And this is something very visible in the ads of the M1 typewriter, relating the gesture of typewriting, so mechanical writing, to the figure of Dante, so the creative gesture. So typewriting is not just a mechanical, serialized, standardized gesture, but is something that allows creativity to be unleashed. We saw something kind of in Russolo's piece, the watershed, really, and the twilight between typewriting as a serial mechanical gesture, but also at the same time as a gesture releasing a new form of creativity. Now, this will be even more true in the over the years, where the gesture of typewriting will be more and more connected to the production of creative thought and creative literary work. So this is the time where works are no longer written by hand, are actually typewritten. And now the typewriter then becomes a creator of imaginary spaces. So our thought, our imagination can be conveyed and be designed really through the act of writing a serialized type. But this form of industrial endeavor, for example, of Olivetti producing all the gears of a typewriter in the same site, is also a cultural gesture. Along the same lines. So it's creating mental spaces, both in imagination and in architecture. And this is the reason why Olivetti invested in typewriting as a way to form a new atmosphere, a new setting, architecture. And this is the factory that was designed by Figini and Pollini in the early 1930s, the Olivetti factory, which is still now an example of modernist architecture in Italy, which is really related to the expansion of this creation of a form from the type to the design of a space, of an architectural space. And this is very important and crucial to understanding why Olivetti is about computing, is about a technology, engineering a technology, but it's also about designing a space, an imaginary space, an architecture, but also designing the actual form of an object. So this coincidence of design and technology is actually the same recipe that will be key for the success of Steve Jobs' Apple. Now, going along with his father, Camillo, his son, Adriano Olivetti, really a visionary entrepreneur, further developed this idea, getting involved the top architects and designers of Italy in the 1950s. So in 1955, Marco Zanuso, designed the Olivetti factory in Sao Paulo, Brazil, as an expansion of the gears of a machine, kind of a module, into a space, a rationalized space. And also in 1956, Olivetti asked Carlo Scarpa, the Venetian architect, to design in St. Mark's Square in Venice a little a little store, which is one of Olivetti's flagship stores, not to sell typewriters, but actually to expose them as pieces of a museum. So to turn the ephemeral commercial object into an object of art. And this will be key to understanding why certain pieces of design, including typewriters or calculators, are now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York as well. Now, the long list of achievements of Olivetti, of products, can be reduced to these ones. And I just want to give you a sense of how Olivetti is the avant-garde of Italian design, but also of Italian technology. And some of its pieces are not just pioneering pieces in engineering and in the development of typewriting into computing, but also are works of art that, as I was saying, are stored in the top museums of the world. I would start from the Lettera 22, letter 22 by Marcello Nizzoli, which is one of the most iconic typewriters that was released in 1950 after World War II. And in 1959, Olivetti, guided by the team of Mario Chu, developed the Elea 9003 that is really the first Italian calculator and one of the forerunners of the computer. So transforming the space of typewriting into an interface, to project the writing onto an interface and turn it into a tool for displaying and calculating or computing. In 1964, Olivetti launches the Programma 101, so 101, or so-called Perottina from the name of its engineer-designer, Pier Giorgio Perotto. And this is one of the first all-in-one commercial programmable desktop calculators. So Olivetti applies the technology of typewriting to the technology of calculating as a form of writing, but also develops through its design, a way of engineering new technology and softwares and ways of computing. Now, to go back to the typewriting, I just want to point out, like my absolute favorite, which is Ettore Sozza's Valentine typewriter, which is the first portable typewriter ever. It was released in 1968, so the year of the turmoils, student turmoils in Europe. At the time of the sexual revolution, really the Valentine embodied a kind of revolution of liberation from the wires, from the imposition of being on a desk. And so the color, the sexiness of the red color, the red plate typewriter Valentine was really a symbol of this liberation of thought, this liberation from the bonds of being tied to desktop. And in 1972, Mario Bellini, one of the other top designers, all the designers we mentioned are really in the all-stars of Italian design. In 1972, Mario Bellini releases one of the most famous calculators by Olivetti, which is the Divisum. And lastly, in 1975, Olivetti releases the P6060. So it's really the first personal computer with a built-in floppy disk. So we move from the process of typewriting to the process of calculating, that are combined together. And we move from the process of designing a type to the process of engineering types that are computing information all together. So this is really the Italian contribution to the development of computers.